June 18, 1815. A gray dawn rises over the fields near the Belgian village of Waterloo. Damp from the previous night's rain, the terrain is a quagmire of thick mud. Farmers and villagers are awakened not by the customary chirping of birds, but by the rhythmic march of thousands of boots and the clattering of hooves on sodden earth. Smoke from campfires lingers in the air, mingling with the faint metallic odor of musket barrels being primed for war. At the epicenter of it all is a figure whose very name has become synonymous with military genius and indomitable ambition: Napoleon Bonaparte. The stakes could not be higher. After escaping exile on the island of Elba just months earlier, Napoleon had returned to France in a blaze of audacious glory, rallying his supporters and reclaiming the throne. But Europe's monarchies would not tolerate another upheaval. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia all had mobilized against him. Waterloo was not just any battlefield. It was the crucible that would determine whether Napoleon would reassert dominance over Europe, or be consigned to history's margins in disgrace. As the morning mist dispersed, Napoleon reviewed his army, the Armée du Nord. Despite his exile, many of his old veterans had returned to his side. To these men, France's fate was inseparable from Napoleon's. They had followed him across Europe, into Egypt and Russia, enduring victory and ruin alike. Yet as the emperor looked across the sodden fields, there were signs this would not be like his past campaigns. His forces, though loyal, were scattered and exhausted. The relentless coalition against him was gaining strength. Napoleon's opponent that day was Britain's Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Though his charisma lacked Napoleon's legendary magnetism, Wellington was assertive, analytical, and possessed an intimate understanding of terrain. He had chosen the battlefield at Mont-Saint-Jean with care, positioning his forces along a ridge, using natural features to enhance his defense. To the east, another threat loomed: Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, a wily veteran who had no love for the French emperor. The chances for Napoleon's victory rested on splitting his enemies before they combined their strength. This delicate strategy would prove horribly elusive. The battle began in earnest around 11:30 a.m., when Napoleon ordered an assault on the Allied positions. Massive columns of French infantry and cavalry marched toward British lines, their shimmering bayonets forming an ominous tide. These were hardened troops, veterans remolded into a disciplined force after Napoleon's return. But the fields they charged across were now thick with mud, drastically slowing their advance. Cannonballs tore through their ranks, mixing with the screams of the wounded. Wellington's forces held firm. The British squares, tight formations of infantry armed with muskets and bayonets, were famously resilient against cavalry. French charges broke against them like waves crashing against cliffs. But the true challenge came in the form of Napoleon's grand assault against the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont. This crucial point was intended to distract British resources, but it turned into a contest of pure attrition. Hours passed, and the French could not break through. Wellington's forces remained firmly entrenched. Meanwhile, time, Napoleon's most precious commodity, was slipping beyond his grasp. To the east, Blücher and his Prussian army were rallying. After being pushed back during an earlier skirmish at Ligny, the Prussians had regrouped, determined to reach Wellington's forces before it was too late. Napoleon had assigned Marshal Grouchy to contain the Prussian threat, but whether by miscommunication, hesitation, or the miseries of the rain-drenched roads, Grouchy failed to act decisively. Napoleon's worst fear began to materialize. The coalition forces were converging. By late afternoon, the tide began to turn. Napoleon had initially held back his Imperial Guard, his most elite fighting force, veterans who had never been defeated in battle. They were legendary, cloaked in a mystique of invincibility, and he had kept them in reserve, waiting for the moment when they could deal the decisive blow. But that moment never seemed to come. As the Allied defenses continued to hold, Napoleon faced a brutal decision. With Blücher's forces now visible on the horizon, advancing in the distance, the carefully calibrated movements of his strategy unraveled into chaos. At around 7:30 p.m., the time for cautious calculation was gone. Napoleon unleashed his Imperial Guard in a desperate attempt to break through Wellington's center. The air was thick with tension as these elite troops charged uphill, drums pounding as they moved with grim precision. Yet Wellington's forces, disciplined and emboldened by the arrival of Prussian reinforcements, held their ground. For the first time in their storied history, the Imperial Guard faltered. They were repelled. From the ridge's vantage point, Wellington waved his hat, a rare gesture of outward emotion, signaling a general advance. Allied troops surged forward, and with the Prussian forces overwhelming the French flank, Napoleon's once mighty army broke apart. The retreat rapidly devolved into a rout. Soldiers threw down muskets, abandoning the field amid scenes of carnage and confusion. Napoleon, once a picture of unflinching authority, sat astride his horse, staring into the abyss of his defeat. By nightfall, the battle was over. Wellington's forces stood bloodied but victorious. To his men, and indeed to much of Europe, this was more than just a battlefield triumph. This was the final reckoning for Napoleon Bonaparte. Reports of the day tallied grim losses. Over 25,000 French soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, with the Allies suffering similarly devastating casualties. The scale of human cost was staggering. As for Napoleon, the veil of invincibility that had shielded his legend for 2 decades had been irreparably torn. In the days after the battle, he fled to Paris, resigning his position for the second and final time. He would go on to surrender to the British, who exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, surrounded by the endless expanse of ocean, he lived out his remaining years, far from the soldiers' cheers and fields of glory he had once commanded. But Waterloo was not just the end of an extraordinary career. It marked the definitive conclusion of an era. Europe, weary from decades of Napoleonic wars, entered a period of relative stability under the Concert of Europe, a system designed to prevent any one nation from dominating the continent as Napoleon had attempted. For the people directly impacted by his reign, however, the soldiers buried beneath Waterloo's muddy soil, and the civilians whose villages had been reduced to ashes, this new era arose from the ashes of incalculable sacrifice. And yet, despite its catastrophic conclusion, Napoleon's legend only grew in the centuries to come. Romanticized accounts of his life, his military genius, and his audacious rise from obscurity transformed him into an archetype of ambition. His defeat at Waterloo, once the symbol of his downfall, became, paradoxically, a cornerstone of his mythos. A tragic hero brought low not by lack of skill, but by the immense forces arrayed against him. The fields of Waterloo are quiet now, but they bear the weight of history. Stand there among the gravestones and the monuments, and you will feel it. The burden of decisions, the roar of cannons, the silence of dreams extinguished. Napoleon's last stand was not merely a military defeat. It was a moment that reshaped the trajectory of the modern world. And for all its drama, glory, and bloodshed, the harrowing truth of Waterloo remains this: even the mightiest ambitions are humbled, in time, by the enduring force of history.